So, Mom, can you tell us about? Oh, I should probably say. I'm sorry. Can you tell me about what career you wanted when you grew up as a child?
Well, I believe the first time I actually thought about that was um, when I was in the second grade. I was hit by a car when I was walking across the street, and my leg was broken. And so the doctor recommended to my mother that I do some sort of repetitive movement to strengthen my leg. And she put me in a ballet class. And I loved that ballet class. I loved the music, the classical music, and the learning French, because of course you have to learn it in French. But most of all, I loved the ability to express my emotions through physical movement. It was wonderful. So I thought about being a ballet dancer.
Mhm. And who is someone from your childhood who inspired you?
Well, that is connected to the first question. Um, when I was a teenager, I auditioned for a dance group at a theater, a local theater in Seattle called Black Arts West. And our dance teacher, Lorna, told us that we had to do every kind of dance, including ballet. And I remember saying to her, Lorna, my ballet teacher before told me that I couldn't do ballet because I wasn't shaped correctly. And just a little context, I was the only Black child in my ballet class, and the ballet teacher told my mother that I would never be able to do ballet because I wasn't shaped correctly. So I repeated this to Lorna, and she said, Honey, who told you that? And I told her, and she consequently took me to see Dance Theater of Harlem, which is a national Black ballet company. And I was so moved. They did a piece called Firebird, and I was just like in tears. And she looked at me afterwards and said, Diane, don't ever believe anyone who tells you what you cannot do. You can do anything if you work hard enough and you are prepared for opportunities. And that changed my life. And I actually had a career in dance early on in my life.
I love that story. Um, can you tell me what your school was like when you were growing up?
So I was actually born in 1954 when the United States Supreme Court decided Brown versus the Board of Education. So, like other cities, I grew up in a segregated community, which was the central area of Seattle, and went to the local school, which was Coleman Elementary. And I loved school. I would walk to school with my brother because it was in walking distance. And basically, there were kids at school who looked like me. I played games with them. I was really curious, and I loved reading and I loved learning. So I loved that school.
Nice. Can you talk about how desegregation played out in Seattle specifically?
Sure. So, again, all of the schools were segregated. Um, and Seattle was one of the first major cities to actually start working on desegregation after Brown versus the Board of Education. And there was certainly a lot of pushback from white families. They just didn't think it was a great idea because desegregation meant not just that Black kids were bused to other neighborhoods, but white children were supposed to be bused to our neighborhoods like ours. So there was a lot of resistance, but in 1963, um, Seattle decided to do a pilot. And of course, I didn't know that at the time, but I was part of this pilot of 250 children who were bused to other schools. Um, and then there's a long history of how that failed in Seattle, but that was kind of my experience at the time.
And what kind of like education was happening within the Black community in Seattle?
Well, my understanding was, being a young girl and being, um, at that age, all I knew is I was learning to read and I was learning to write. And um, I know that in terms of the adults and the civil rights activists in the community, they didn't feel like we were getting a great education. We didn't have the best resources. Our teachers weren't paid well. So there was really this energy to try to um, give us greater opportunities. And so it was them that was really pushing at the time for desegregation.
Nice. Um, and outside of schools, like outside of public schools, were there other sort of community education efforts?
Well, certainly. And I was going to talk about this a little bit later, but one of the things that the leaders did, because they felt like not only were kids of color getting a substantial education, they weren't learning about themselves. As you can imagine, in the 60s, um, even now it's a challenge, but in the 60s, we learned very little about our heritage and our culture. And so there would be something called freedom schools that I actually attended in 1964, where children were actually taken out of school and spent 2 days at a local church learning from civic leaders about civic education, about our heritage. And the goal was to really try to empower us with knowledge about our heritage so that we could feel stronger about who we were.
It's amazing. I also went to a freedom school when I was a teenager. So,
Oh, cool. And they're still going on now.
yeah. Um, what is the significance of educational opportunity for you?
Well, it's extremely significant because I think that when you are literate and when you um, have the ability to develop critical thinking skills, it just opens the whole world to you. Not in just in terms of academic learning, but just learning about life, um, learning and being curious about other ways of living, being interested in other languages and other cultures, and wanting to travel. Um, all of those things I was fortunate to have the opportunity to do. But um, I really feel like all children should have that opportunity to learn.
I
And
think you all,
just as
but
it's
you also
difficult
had a
for
great closing,
children
so
to
if
learn when they're
you all are
hungry,
good, whatever.
it's also difficult for children to learn when they're not when they feel they're in unsafe environments, and when the adults don't have the expectation that they can achieve and that they can be successful.
Yeah. Can you just give us some more details about the Freedom School and what like a day there would look like?
Sure. So again, when I went, I have to say I didn't really understand completely what was going on, but all I knew that I was in this place with lots of children who looked like me, and for the first time, lots of adults who were teaching who looked like me, and seemed to be, really concerned about us and our future. We were fed well. There were moments of laughter and
Absolutely. Thank you
engagement.
all.
Um,
So we're gonna
and
do
it
10
felt
seconds
very
of room
different
tone.
than the
So it just
school I
means if you
was
all could
bused
just be
to and was
quiet for
going
10
to
seconds
every
and then we'll
day.
stop the recording.
Um,
What was it like for you?
yeah, I went to a couple of summers to freedom schools that were run by the Seattle Young People's Project, which is an organization in Seattle that is like an activist organization that is run by young people. Like there's adult facilitators, but it's primarily like the young people that lead. Um, and so we just had sort of lots of different speakers that would come and talk to us about different, and we like lead discussions
Mm,
about just sort of different aspects of identity and oppression and marginalization. So not just about race, but about gender, sexuality, disability, all these things. Um, so it's kind of nice to see how it's like grown and become more inclusive. It was also, I had a really interesting experience at one of them. We had Freedom School for the day, and then we went to one of the participants' apartments, who was like a young like woman in her 20s. And it was a bunch of people of color. It was a very diverse program, but this particular day was a bunch of people of color, and we went to the pool, and so it was like maybe 10 of us or something that we got in the pool, and the manager came out and started screaming at us and said, "You all need to get out of the pool. You are taking over." Because apparently a neighbor that had complained previously about her bringing friends of color over, like saw us and complained. And it was just, it felt like a really formative experience that like the next
mm,
day we got to go back and into Freedom School and talk about this experience and
mm.
kind of uh, like situated in what we were learning.
Yeah.
Um, can you tell me about when you found out you would be bused to a new school?
From what I can remember is I was um, confused. Um, I asked my mom, "Why am I going to another school?" And she basically said, "Because I told you you're going to a new school." There was no conversation. Um, and I was very curious, but my mom was a very strict disciplinarian, and you didn't question anything she said. So I just basically kind of resolved that this was what I was going to have to do, but I had no idea what I was getting myself into.
Can you describe what that transition was like and what your new school was like?
So I was 9 at the time, and um, my mom kept me close at home. I didn't get to go many places unless I was with her. I think she was just worried about keeping me safe. But now, instead of walking to school with my brother, who was 3 years older and made sure I was safe, I had to catch two public buses to get to a school that was in a white, wealthy, gated community. And I didn't have the words for this at the time, but um, a lot of young Jewish children attended this school, um, and we were just kind of working class family, so I mostly had kind of hand-me-down clothes. Sometimes they didn't match, and I never thought about it at my previous school, but at this school, um, people noticed and people would talk about my clothes, and it was the first time I started looking at myself in a very different way. um, oh, and when I went to the school, there were only two African American people integrating the school, and the other person was not in my class, so it was just me. And it was kind of scary.
Yeah. Can you tell me about a time you felt unsafe or excluded at school?
So that was pretty much all the time. Um, One of my experiences was often children would have parties, bar mitzvahs or other parties, and they would actually have the invitations in hand, and they would walk down each aisle and give each person an invitation and just skip me. And I remember thinking, what is wrong with me? Nobody invites me to anything. I had these questions about my value and, the way I looked and all of those sorts of things. Um, and like young girls at the time, I would have crushes on guys. And of course, everybody in my class was white. And this one guy, David, I had a crush on. And I honestly think, Destiny, it was because he was one of the people who spoke to me, because a lot of people didn't speak to me. And so I remember like having a crush on him and writing Diane and David on my notebook. And one day, one of the girls saw that and snatched it and started saying, "Can you believe it? He would never even take a look at you. You're so." And I just remember feeling humiliated, just like, oh my God, you're right. Why would he like me? Just very insecure. But one incident really stands out. Um, and that was one day I was on the playground, and one of the little boys said, "Your mother is a Nigger." And I just went crazy. I chased him around the playground like 3 times. I had him on the ground and I was holding him like this. And I remember feeling like it was almost like out of body. I felt this incredible rage and just out of control. And one of the monitors pulled me off of him and said, "You're going to the principal's office." And I remember not being scared yet, because I thought, if I explain what happened, they'll understand. And to be honest, when I think about it now, it probably just wasn't the anger I was feeling at him for saying that. It was probably a culmination of all of the emotion and negative feelings I had been feeling at that school. But when I went to the principal's office, I was trying to explain, and they said, "It doesn't matter what he said. You were violent. You're being suspended from school." And I was like, "But wait." And they're like, "We don't want to hear it. You're suspended." And I remember thinking, this isn't fair. This just isn't fair. But the worst part was going home that day and telling my mother. And before I could even explain it, she just erupted in anger at me. And she said, "You're embarrassing me. You're going to go back to that school and you're going to apologize." And I was like, "But Mom, you don't know what they said." And she's like, I don't care what they said. You're going to go back there and apologize." And I just remember feeling so unsafe, and like nobody was advocating for me. Nobody was there for me. Nobody cared about me. And I remember just thinking to myself, in my way, as a 9-year old, thinking, you're on your own. Whatever happens, you're just going to have to navigate it on your own. Um, excuse me. Um, so, and the 2 years I was at that school, I never really felt safe.
Wish I could give you a hug. Um,
Oh,
okay.
um, in regard to the principal's reaction to the other child, it really seemed that that child's feelings, safety, were certainly prioritized over mine. Um, he was allowed to say how he felt and what I did to him, but I didn't feel like I was allowed to talk about, you know, how unsafe I felt emotionally. um, and he didn't get kicked out of school. So, yeah, there was clearly this sense of me being othered and me having less value as a student at that school.
I feel like that's just such a um, common thread. Like every Black woman and girl that I know has stories of, like, it doesn't matter what was done to us. It's the reaction always the thing that is cool.
Right, right.
Um, can you tell about a time you felt included or successful at school?
So again, I didn't necessarily feel included, but one of the things that saved me during that time was I love to read, and reading was also kind of like an escape to me. And so I always had a book, and sometimes when I didn't have anyone to play with, I would just read my book. And so one of the teachers noticed that. And at the time in Seattle, there was this local television program called Televenture Tales. And young people would read a book and they'd go on the show and talk about the book. And I believe that the book that I talked about was A Wrinkle in Time, which is one of my favorites. um, and so I felt good because I loved reading. I loved describing the book. And one of the things I loved about the book is the young girl in there, Meg, feels awkward and unattractive and not smart, but her family embraces her and loves her and tells her, how great she is. And I was able to talk about that book and probably felt seen and visible for one of the few times of my experience at that school.
Looking back, what do you think people should know about desegregation?
I think that um, desegregation is not necessarily an experiment that you should put upon kids of color. I think that um, all schools, all schools need to be equitably resourced with good teachers who are paid well, with great textbooks, but also with counselors and people who actually believe in the children and can help them navigate the difficult emotions of um, of racism, of the stress that comes with that. I don't think um, I think so much was lacking in my experience. I even think if there was one person who I could culturally identify with at that school, who I felt like cared about me, it would have helped me um, sort of navigate those 2 years without feeling like, um, there were times when I wouldn't answer questions even when I knew the answer because I was so afraid if I was wrong, you know, it's like I didn't want to stand out for all the things that I felt bad about, but I did want to be seen and seen for the person and the qualities and the talents that I did have. Um, so I just don't think that desegregation is a real answer to educational equity.
Yeah, I feel like the way, at least for me, it was taught in schools. It's always this school was desegregated, and it might have been rough at first. There were protesters, but eventually, it all worked out, and there's just no um, attention given towards these students' experiences that were really traumatic experiences in school.
Right.
Yeah. Um, is there a defining moment from your work towards educational equity that stands out?
It does. And it actually, thinking about this, um, it really brought up this situation. So, um, at one point in my career, I was a youth program director for the YWCA, and this was in Seattle. And I worked with young people in Rainier Vista, which was an area with, it was a project area with, low income children. And I had an after school program, and kids had to come and do their homework first. And then I had a number of activities and things for them to do that they really enjoyed. And at one point, there were some boys in my program who I noticed didn't have homework. And so I said, "Hey, you guys, how come you're not doing your homework?" And they're like, "We don't have homework." And I said, um, "You have to have homework. You're in high school." And they said, "Well, actually, Diane, we were suspended from school." In order to kind of set a little context, so they were in the South End Seattle in this poor area, and they were bused to Ballard High School, which was in the North End, at a very nice area with good schools. Um, and I asked them, "Well, what did your parents say?" And they said, "Well, they just, they kind of said, well, I guess we have to deal with it." What I learned, Destiny, is they were kicked out of school for the entire year. And it was the first week of November. It's like, how can this happen? So I went up to the school and I asked to speak to the principal. And the first thing that made me kind of question that environment was she said, "Well, I don't have any place for you to sit. And I wasn't expecting you." And I said, "Well, I don't really need to sit down, but I would love to have a conversation with you." And she's like, "Well, who are you?" I said, "I'm a community um, person. I have these young men in my program, and I'm very concerned about their future." And in that conversation with her, she basically said, "Well, these kids are just bad. I mean, bad. Like, this is an educator using the word bad." And I said, "Well, these are young people who are growing and they need their education." But basically, she said, "Well, you can talk to the vice principal about this." So I went to the vice principal, um, and he basically kind of had the same thing. "Well, Diane, these kids really don't want to learn." And I thought, man, these are leaders in the school, and this is their understanding about children. So I'm like really hot now. I'm really mad. So I go and I I try to talk to a school board member who is a Black man. And I'm like, surely if I can talk to him, he will help me in this situation. And so I tried a number of times to meet with him, and it just didn't work out. So I'm really kind of getting down about this whole thing. And finally, I remember a community leader who is somewhat of a friend to mine. And I go to him and I say, "Larry, please, you've got to help me. Nobody cares about our children. Nobody." And they're just, and he said, "Okay, Diane." I started crying. And he said, "Look, Diane, I can help you. I care about them. And I'm actually a mediator for the school, for Seattle Public Schools." I was like, "Oh, great." So we set up a meeting. He's there, I'm there, the kids are there, one mother is there, the principal is there. So during this conversation, now, mind you, all the people who are around this table, the principal actually says this: I'm not going to say the boy's real name, but she says, well, Johnny, I don't know why you want to get back in school anyway. If you were here for 4 to 5 years, you would never graduate anyway. I was so appalled. And I remember just looking at him and saying, don't ever believe that. And I tried to say the same thing that Lorna told me, but we were able to successfully get all those kids back in school. And the third time we were there, kind of mediating, the principal looks at me and says, so it seems to me I'm never going to be able to discipline any of these kids because you're going to be up here with all your friends. And I said, that's right. I will be.
I love it.
So that was that story.
Okay. Do you think that experience was key in the trajectory of your career?
I do because I did a lot of work later. I started working for the city in the Human Services Division and worked on helping students who are experiencing homelessness, trying to create resources for them, as well as young people who were sexually exploited. I was able to work with the council to get some money to put aside some resources to help those young people. And then eventually, my city manager had me begin the first Office of Equity and Human Rights, and I was the chief equity officer there, and that's where I retired from. That was the city of Tacoma a couple years ago. Oh, I suppose one of the reasons I loved working with youth and students is because of my own experience. I never, ever wanted anybody to feel the isolation and um, just those negative experiences that I felt. And I knew the difference if a young person had one person advocating for them, that it would make a difference in their lives. And one of the students that I advocated for in the situation that I talked about, once on Mother's Day, he wrote me this beautiful card, and his mother died giving birth to him and his twin, and he told me that he was grateful for all the things I had done and that I was like a mother to him. It was just really sweet.
And has been in some ways a generational trajectory because that is for the same reasons I became a teacher as well. Um,
Absolutely.
how does your experience with desegregation shape who you are today?
I guess in addition to what I've already said, I kept trying to think of what is a positive thing that happened out of that situation. And other than really advocating for others, um, I do believe that I was able to get a strong academic foundation from being at that school for 2 years. Because when I went on to what we call junior high school then, um, I came back to my own community to go to school. And I was a straight A student and I was on the Honor Society. And I think that even though it was difficult learning in that environment, because I was curious, I think that it kind of helped me um, really academically in my, towards my future.
Oh, well, my mom definitely passed on. Oh, I'm sorry. I shouldn't be talking about the other person. You definitely passed on your love of reading. We always read together as I was a child. When I was a child, and you always like would read books with such like passion and like perform them with all this drama. And it was like other kids like my friends and cousins would always be like, "Get your mom to read a book." It was so much fun. And so that's just something that I've always kind of wanted to pass on to children, like love of literacy. Um, and I also just went to lots of different types of schools growing up and was very aware of like the different types of education available in different communities.
Mhm,
Such a
mhm,
um, like sometimes from year to year, it would be just such a contrast. And so I really, um, it was really important to me to um, make the kinds of sort of educational freedom and resourced schooling available to all kids that were
mhm.
available to them.
Yes.
Okay, last question. How do you think your experience with schools shaped you as a parent?
Well, definitely, I wanted to parent my child a little different than my mom parented me. Um, when I think of the progress in generations, I am so delighted. When I think of my mom, who I learned later in life couldn't read, and the impact that had on her life and me, and I think of because I love to read and learn to read, um, the impact that that had on my life and your life. And then when I think of your generation, of you, not only did you love to read, you became a reading specialist in the schools that you taught in. And knowing that, I know that your daughter is going to also love reading and probably pass that on. And um, I know for me too, I wanted to make sure because there was no affection in my relationship with my mother. It's why I told you I loved you every single day because I didn't want you to guess. I wanted you to know that I was there for you, that I cared about you, and that you could talk to me about anything. And I also, it's because I had that huge library of books. I thought if there's something you don't want to ask me, you can always look it up in one of the books on our shelves. Um, so I think all of our experience certainly define us. And although mine wasn't the greatest, I'm grateful that I learned what not to do and that I had this sense of hope when I had you, um, that your life could be better than mine. And I'm so grateful that it is. And I love you, sweetheart.
I love you too. And I'm really proud of you.
Oh, thank you.
Hi, yes, there are a couple of questions I'd like to follow up with. I'm just going to keep my camera off since we're still recording.
Okay,
First, thank you so much for sharing all of that.
sure.
It's really such a privilege to hear about all your experiences and so interesting to hear about how those have led to where you are today.
Yes.
Um, I'd love to hear a little bit more, Diane, about your experiences in freedom schools. I know we dug into that a little bit, but you mentioned feeling, a lot safer there, surrounded by people who looked like you. Could you just kind of take Destiny and us along with you to that space? Like describe, you said it was in a church, kind of just describe that type of environment, how you felt there. Were those social connections much deeper than the ones you had to excuse me, than compared to the school you were bused to?
So first, I need to kind of clarify that this was the very beginning of the idea of freedom schools. So there was only 2 days that we were together, and um, it was just I just heard you're not going to school for the next couple days. You're going to this church, um, and I remember it sort of being a big deal because I went to school every day. There was no excuse about not being at school. So it seemed kind of mysterious because, gee, I'm not going to be in school for a couple days, and kind of a relief. um, so during those 2 days, I, I was so young, so it's hard to remember the actual curriculum, but I just remember like all of these because they were all Black, male and female, um, leaders, teachers, lecturers, facilitators, um, talking to us, talking to me in a different way than at school. It seemed more personable. It seemed warmer. Um, it- School was kind of like, if I can look back, and with my experiences now, it's like being in a big lecture hall where there's no connection to the person you're talking to. And that's how school felt. But in the Freedom School, it felt like people were smiling at you and asking you questions, and it seemed inviting and welcoming, and um being next to kids who looked like me, who laughed with me, that I didn't feel I wasn't measuring up to because we all kind of seemed similar. Those are the things that I can tell you about it. Is that helpful?
Yes, absolutely. And um, Destiny, did that have any impact on sending Destiny to Freedom School, or was it a similar situation in that it was a few days off from the regular day-to-day curriculum?
No, mine was during the summer.
And how old were you, Destiny?
I was in high school. I don't remember exactly what year, but I went like I think it was 2 summers. I went one in high school and then um one in college. I came back and was kind of helping with it. Participating.
And can you tell me a little bit more about how Freedom School was supportive in creating a comfortable environment for you, especially after the incident at the pool? What was it like going back to Freedom School the next day?
Um I guess it felt um like normally something like that would happen and it would just be something that was hurtful, and that I would just kind of maybe internalize or kind of bury. But the fact that we all got to come back together and talk about it, and we couldn't. Um, you always, I think, when you go through like any kind of racist incident by yourself, you start to feel like maybe I'm making this up in my mind, or maybe you just kind of question yourself and your analysis. Um, but this was, it was like, oh, we all understand the subtext here. Like we all saw what just happened. We all understand why specifically the words like "you're taking over" was being used. We all understood like where the anger was coming from. Um, and the fact that we got to like process it together, with like adults who were listening to us and hearing us out. um, I think that made it is what made it more of a formative experience of sort of, I don't know, like deeper understanding, as opposed to it just being kind of uh, a hurtful situation.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you had that experience afterwards to be able to talk through that with other people who understand,
Mm.
the context and have that same experiences as you do. And I have one last follow-up question for Diane. You talked about the busing program. Could you tell me a little bit, or tell Destiny a little bit more about stepping on that bus for the first time? What was going through your head? And do you remember like what the weather was like, switching from different buses, how that would feel?
Yeah. Um, I think I was nervous, of course, about catching the bus, because I had never caught the bus by myself. And so at first there was concern. Like I wrote, I had written down like where I was supposed to get off, where I was supposed to transfer, and all of that. But first there was this fear that I was going to get lost. Um, and of course, there were no cell phones or any of that at that time. And like, what if I get lost and I don't know where I'm going and nobody helps me? And then my mother gets mad because I didn't make it to school on time. So it was kind of scary navigating that. And then um, also just, I think I was worried, particularly when I got on that second bus to go to that gated community, that people were looking at me at a certain way because I didn't have really nice clothes, and you know my hair was different, and I worried about that. So even as I became familiar um, with that route of getting to school, sometimes you miss a bus or a bus is late. And I just remember having this feeling like you can't be late, because if you're late, that's going to be another strike against you, because people always say that Black people are late. And I just remember not wanting to be that person who comes in the classroom late.
And I
Yeah.
don't have any more questions for either of you, so I will turn it back to you if there's anything else you want to ask or any other way you want to close up your recording.
So is you the facilitator? um, I guess the I guess what I really want to do right now is just thank you for this opportunity, for StoryCorps, and for my daughter, because I realized a lot of the trauma that I had around this, other than kind of talking it through with friends, was kind of buried there. And, even though maybe the wound was healed, there may have been a little bit of a scab left. And I almost feel like this was cathartic for me, thinking back on it, doing research, and finding actually about what was happening at that time, knowing as an adult how difficult it would be as an adult, but really looking at that young Diane and realizing how challenging it was, I almost felt like, phew, I made it through that. So this has just really been cathartic, and I'm grateful that my daughter was able to do this with me. Thank you.